Hi, everybody. My name is David Leclerc. I'm the host of the Chalk Podcast. This is not the Chalk Podcast. This is actually a new series we're launching where we wanted to explore the different tools, the different things that are available in Flowlandia that may benefit your core facility, your research environments. And so I don't have a name at this point for this series. So at the time we publish, we'll get something up. I'm here with Danielle Vassels, the co-host, is the assistant professor at MSU, assistant core director over there as well. And today, incredibly excited to host Andrew Card and Nick Borkowski from First American. Basically, people we met at the last ABRF meeting. We were discussing getting lease on instruments, get them in your core a little bit faster. And questions are all about like, how does that benefit your car? How do we basically can make use of that tool and help our research? Andrew and Nick, do you want to start by just presenting First American, the service you're offering, and we'll move from there?
Absolutely. You want to kick us off?
Yeah,
Andrew?
sounds good. Well, thank you again, David, for having us on your podcast today. So my name's Andrew Card. I've been at First American for just about 6 years now, originally serving on our healthcare vertical, then making the switch to higher education a few years ago. Nick, want to give a quick introduction yourself?
Yeah, Nick Borkowski. I've been here with First American for about 12 and a half years, working within our higher education group the entirety of that time. And the last, I would say 6 or so years, been exclusively focused on really building what we refer to as our national university business here at First American, building program solutions that are really directly focused on serving our R1 and R2 university clients. So excited to be here with you both today.
Yeah, appreciate it. And just for more background on First American, we'll kind of start there. So First American, we are backed by City National Bank and the Royal Bank of Canada and act as the U.S. equipment finance arm of RBC. We've been around since 1994, serving a multitude of different industries from healthcare to education, manufacturing, logistics. And as Nick mentioned, our higher education team's been around for over 20 years, but then Nick and one of our other colleagues, Todd, helped launch our national university team to address the unique challenges and needs from Research 1 to Research 2 universities. To date, we work with over 60 R1, R2s throughout the country, and we help facilitate funding for needs across campus. So from deferred maintenance, to IT initiatives, to athletics, to research, which we'll be diving into today. I guess how we facilitate funding throughout the university is what we call a master lease program. So we work with different departments and central procurement and finance to set general terms and conditions that all different departments throughout the university can utilize for different fundings. A couple of different structures that would be most relevant for our conversation today. To give a quick background on that before we dive in a little more. A finance lease and an operating lease. So those are the two primary structures that we focus on. Finance lease is similar to a car loan, right? So if you're going to buy a car and not wanting to pay all that cash up front, but want to use that equipment for a long time, right? So you might look to finance over the course of 5 years. In the research side, that's most common equipment that we see are NMRs, CT scans, lab renovations, really anything that researchers are looking to acquire but don't have the budgetary support for that year, or they're looking for a more programmatic approach. The other one's operating type lease. So this is more similar to a car lease where you're looking to refresh over the course of a few years. So most common in research are microscopes, genetic sequencing equipment, mass specs, flow cytometers, and bridge to grant solutions. So this is one where you pay for the use, not ownership of the equipment, and then to term, you can return the equipment and upgrade it, buy it, or extend the lease. But that's a quick background on First American and some of the structures that we see on the research side. Not sure if you have any questions or anything else before we dive into the next topic.
Yeah, no, I mean, so the option to get instruments are basically get a grant or get internal funding.
Mm-hmm.
The indirect costs that we all learn exist recently. So I guess the question is, what's the advantage of getting a lease over just buying your own machine? And yeah, so basically, where would be the advantage here as opposed to actually taking full ownership? Like it's basically getting the funds, obviously, but like what do you guys see as the advantage, like the added value of getting a lease?
Yeah, I think historically, David, one of the big challenges that we see perennially with our higher ed clients is not only external funding through programs like the NSF MRI program or the NIH S10 program, which we've been very active in structuring solutions that are specifically geared toward those applications, and we can talk a bit more about that as we get further on in the discussion. But I would say one of the perennial challenges that we see is just the level of competition for both internal and external dollars to refresh instrumentation. And I think as you look, across the research enterprise at many of the top universities, especially if you're located in a city like Boston or Philadelphia or Chicago, where there's a larger concentration of top tier universities and core facilities, there is also a competitive aspect to this, right? Where universities want to be able to keep certain research activity on their home campuses rather than have to send that research out to other universities. So I think what we've seen is, a lease-based acquisition model within cores. I would say, aligns really well strategically with where the vice president of research office and core facilities administration is ultimately looking to go, which is, building a model for research instrumentation acquisition that ultimately gives what the administration desires the most, which is a lot more predictability in the capital budget, right? And converting as much of those capital budget asks into operating type expenses to create more predictability in that flow of expenses. Because as we see more and more, and hear this from core facilities administration, a lot of universities are really trying to pull away from the model where we have individual PIs and researchers expending grant dollars to, acquire a high-end microscope that is really going to sit in their lab unused for a good portion of the time that instrument is there on campus. So what we see in cores is, a lease-based refresh model can really offer a way to operationalize those capital expenditures in a way that gives the administration more predictability in how to build the cost into user services fees. Rather than, what we see in today's environment where there's competition for internal dollars, there's competition for external dollars, and whether you're, picked for those applications or not is ultimately the deciding factor in whether or not you're getting a new instrument. Which can be challenging for obvious reasons in certain cores, especially cores where you have instrumentation that the technology cycle is compressing more and more every year.
Maybe we can switch it into more simple terms.
Sure.
Sometimes my wife likes to call me very simple. So I'm a small core. I've got two instruments. This is a hypothetical. Why do I care? How am I using this?
Yeah, great question. So I think for us, it's important to note that when you lease instrumentation, there's no part of, I would say, the means of the acquisition that would step in between a university or a core and the equipment suppliers that they currently work with. So I think that's an important note, is that should never step in the way of that. But I think from our standpoint, as you look at your user service fee model, Dan, I might kick that question back to you and say, how do you currently pursue dollars internally to refresh instrumentation when that's a need for you? What mechanisms are available to you today in order to do that?
Well, I think that's what's hard. When I get to talk to different cores and the struggles that they have, even around the world, you've got the small cores, the medium cores, the big cores, the haves, the have-nots, and everything and anywhere in between. So a common issue I see right now with folks is, I've got an old LSR2 that's aging out. I need a new instrument. And what are my options? I can go to the university and say, we need money to replace this. And they might say, look, you're small, you're not our priority. I can try getting PIs together. I can try writing grants together. But end of the day, I got an instrument that's no longer being supported.
Yep.
I need to shift my users onto something else. I need a new instrument, and I don't have a way to reliably do that. I
Yep.
know that this instrument's going to fail, and when it does, I'm not going to be able to fix it,
Yep.
and it's going to hurt my users. So
So maybe in
how am I using it?
Yeah, so maybe in the simplest form, if we want to keep focused on budgets and budget asks, from the onset, you think about high-end instrumentation where, you may be laying out upwards of $500,000 or maybe even over $1 million for, an instrumentation refresh. That's obviously a much bigger budget ask, right? So when you talk about going to align university stakeholders, whether that's the central finance and capital planning office, and you're trying to solicit dollars there, or whether that's having to go across a multitude of departments, it's a big ask. So I think one of the advantages to a lease-based model is it takes that large upfront expense and spreads it over, a number of budget cycles that really makes it a more palatable commitment. And I would say where we've seen the most success is cores that have strong relationships with different departments heads and different department chairs, where they can now bring, instead of a $750,000 ask for a new instrument, they're bringing an annualized expense with user fees already built into that. And maybe your user fees aren't covering the full lease payment, but now you have a much more palatable ask that you're going, maybe to 3 or 4 department chairs and saying, you're going to have faculty and staff that are going to use this instrument, and we're looking for each of you to kick in, this much per year, rather than, hey, we need to close this $300,000 funding gap versus what we're going to be able to make up in user fees. So, I think that's just one of the probably most direct ways that this can assist, is it better aligns the expenses of the instrument acquisition with the user service model fee and the annualized budgeting approach that many of the departments are going to take as you're looking for institutional support. So hopefully that helps.
Let me see, and if I can recapitulate that. So now I don't need the departments or anybody else to give me the bike lump sum.
Yep.
Instead, they're the ones co-signing on this loan, and instead we only have to then do a monthly payment of, we'll say, $5,000. So now me as the core director, and I may not be as familiar with all the logistical,
Sure.
things in some of these terms. Now the question is just, can I cover this? Can I cover the $5,000 a month for the 3 years, the 5 years? So if we're thinking about it in that term, I know that a lot of cores, if I get a new instrument, I rely on that first year of the service contract being free for my billing. So, I mean, is there the equivalent here where we don't have to pay anything for the first year and then it kicks into the, the $5,000 or $7,000 a month?
Yeah, do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, no, we definitely have different tailored and structured financing. So like that's definitely an option. We really work with the university to build out the best budget approach for the individual department unit, right? So like in our bridge to grant solution for when universities are applying for, let's say, NIH S10 program, where they're looking to get the data and present it to NIH and part of their application. That's part of how we write that lease, is like deferred funding, right? So like in 12 months will be the first payment, or we will delay payments till month 6, whatever really works best with the university department and the central finance team to help alleviate some of those pressures. But I'd say definitely every university is different. We go on the credit strength of the institution, not the individual department, which helps a lot. So we're able to build out really any unique financing solutions as we see fit.
Yeah.
So then,
go ahead.
What's the catch? How are you making money on this? Because clearly you're not doing this out of the goodness of your hearts.
Yes, I'll touch on that. On the operating lease side, so a lessor like First American takes the residual risk in the equipment, right? So at the end, say if we have a 3-year operating type lease, so the university would be making lease payments for those 3 years for the use of the equipment, and lessor like First American takes residual risk in that equipment. And basically what that means is our asset management team, who does this every single day and exclusively work in the higher education, will remarket the equipment based on what they expect to sell it for. And then that helps lower the cost of ownership.
Yeah. So ultimately, if you're used to a car, if you've ever entered into a car lease before, right, you could ask the same question about how does a car dealership make money in a car lease, because the payments that you're laying out are far less than the acquisition cost of the vehicle. Typically, there's two common scenarios you're going to see is that either A, the lessor of the vehicle is going to buy the equipment out for its fair market value at that time, at which time the dealer is made whole. Or you're going to see a situation where they want to return the car, and how does the dealer make money in that case? They're going to resell that vehicle on their used car lot. So I just think that helps put it into a term, into terms that probably, is helpful for folks that may be listening here, more everyday examples. And then yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, if I could then spin it back, because I know lots of people that have done car leases, but I don't think they understand car leases.
Right.
So you're saying you're already planning on buying it back. So it's a lease. So I'm saying you're giving me $300,000 to buy the new equipment. I get the new cytometer, but you get it back after 3 years, and you're planning on selling it for $200,000 after those 3 years. You've determined that that's how much it's going to be worth. And so then really then that cost is, say, $100,000 to me.
Yep.
But that loan that we've stretched out over the 3 years is roughly, you take some percentage as well. So maybe it's 10%. So it's 110,000 then that I have to cover over those 3 years. Is that the rough gist?
I think that's a fair rough gist. I would just say generally when we think about assets like research instrumentation, I think the car lease example is helpful because it's an example that's there in folks' everyday lives. I think where we're always candid and want to be direct with folks is that, a vehicle that's coming off a lease in 3 years is going to have a much higher residual value than, a specialized microscope that may be coming off lease. So you wouldn't expect the residual investment from a lessor like First American to maybe be as aggressive as what you're used to in a car lease. But in theory, very much, in line with how you laid it out, where there's a risk that the lender takes on what are we going to be able to do with that equipment at the end if it is returned to us at the end of the lease. And then your lease payment is going to be based on that delta. So the acquisition cost of the equipment minus what we think it's going to be worth at the end of the lease, and then your lease payments are based on that amount. So again, depending on the length of the lease and the type of the asset, it might be realistic to expect on a 3 or 4 year lease to lay out, 75 to 85% of the original equipment costs. And again, I think one of the advantages to universities that are using that type of a model, they want the latest and greatest equipment in their labs. There's certainly case studies that we could point folks that are listening to get an idea of how other facilities have leveraged that program. But I think that was a great summary.
Because I think that's the attractiveness to a core facility like mine, where we are aiming to attract the best researchers. And having a core facility with the latest equipment is definitely a key part of that function at the university. So being able to get rid of older platforms faster.
You got it.
Yeah.
Than so right.
But again, for the smaller ones where it's hard to even replace something, there are things beyond a lease program. I've had this one cytometer for the last 20 years. I need my next cytometer for 20 years.
Yep.
I can't save money up to buy that. The university doesn't necessarily have it. So I could potentially do then a 10-year loan where I got a year to get that up, and then I gotta be making the payments based off the user base. You've done, really long extended ones like that too.
You got
it. Absolutely.
My biggest hesitation again, if I'm a small core, is I got to keep this darn thing running. So I need to do service contracts in there too. Can we bundle service contracts into the loan?
We can, and I would say that's typically going to be a decision for the individual university and core administration and research administration, because there are different ways that service contracts are accounted for a little bit from university to university. But in theory, absolutely. And I would say that's the most common, the most common methodology that we see is a core that wants to acquire the instrument, effectively prepay a service contract, and bundle that all into a lease payment. But you also have, where we've seen cores that do an extended service contract, and they're going to include the first year of the service contract in the lease, and then they're just going to pay that service contract annually as a separate transaction with the provider. So I think that's important too, because every university is in a different place too with the resources that they have available on campus. That there's really not a one size fits all for service contract strategy, right? If you have a team on campus that's well versed in servicing a certain type of instrument, you may not feel the need to invest in that service contract. If you don't have those resources, you probably will have the need to invest in that service contract. So again, I think that's probably, as you think about benefits of working with a third-party finance company that's part of a bank like First American, there's a lot more flexibility in how that part of it can be addressed. I do think you'll probably have some listeners that, may have ventured down this road before. And I would say the most common avenue we see, or when we engage with researchers, is folks that have tried this before with what we refer to as an OEM finance program. So again, you have the supplier of the equipment coming in, and then, a PI says, well, I don't have the money for it in my budget. So they bring a lease option to the table. And it's typically to help, right? It's not to hurt trying to get the instrument in the door. I think the biggest challenge that we see in those situations is that the resources that the suppliers have at their disposal tend to be generalists. So even if it is labeled as a finance program for that OEM, it's typically a bank that is ultimately servicing that deal. And oftentimes the professionals that they're working with through those transactions are just they're leasing and financing generalists, so they may not be as experienced working in higher education or healthcare or research. So that's great when you just need to place an instrument. It's not so great when that generalist may or may not understand how an S10 actually works. And the way that the PI describes it to them, that particular generalist thinks that they're just looking for a 2-year rental agreement that they want to be able to return the equipment at the end. So I think there is just sometimes a disconnect in understanding what folks are actually looking for and need, and how that works, with the university big picture. And to me, that's one of the strategic assets of First American, is that the master lease programs that we design, they are designed to fit within university procurement standards and university finance policies. And I think that that's something that you lose along the way too, is, oftentimes, and I'll be candid with this group, we talk with finance and procurement professionals very consistently, and very consistently one of the pieces of feedback that we get is that professionals on the research side of the house tend to sometimes take deals a bit further than they should before they decide to reach out to university procurement and finance. And then before we know it, we get to a spot where, wow, we've been working on this for a year and we didn't even know that we're not allowed to do it this way. I would say that's a I can use Michigan State as an example of, you all are an entity that has a centralized master lease program available to you. That's there. It's owned by the Treasury and Debt Management Office and the Capital Finance Office. That was a competitively bid program. First American's actually a part of that program. So this is an important, when you think about leasing and financing, there are important considerations for the central university, because they've got to make sure they're accounting for these the right way, that they've been procured the right way, and that they're being serviced in a way that aligns with, university debt and capital finance policy. That sounds overly complex and complicated, but in reality, it's not, and it's typically a conversation that can be navigated fairly expeditiously if it's engaged on the front end. Where you tend to run into challenges is, when you're bringing those folks in the loop late stages in the game. So it's just something that we see very, very commonly.
So the universities already know how to work with you guys. That's what my takeaway was there, because
You got it.
that's a lot of finance talk, and I may not be familiar with all of this. And my biggest hurdle might just be, is this worth it? Is it even possible, right? Mm-hmm. So if I'm getting that 10-year loan to buy this new instrument,
yep.
What's the general interest rates? Is there a range there that you can generalize for me?
I can, and we'll speak to that in the current environment, and just noting that, your finance rates are always going to be subject to where the market is currently. But I would say in the example that you're highlighting, depending on the structure that we use and the tax treatment of the structure that we use, then we won't get into too much finance lingo, but you could be looking at a 4.5 to 6.5% cost of money on an acquisition like that right now, which is very competitive. And we actually had a meeting not too long ago, Dan, with your central team, and I think they even acknowledged it's a very competitive cost of money, and Michigan State's one of the stronger credits in higher education, so it's a good benchmark for us.
Yeah.
When you get into the lease-based acquisition strategy, so true operating type leases where we want to rent equipment, use it for 3 or 4 years and return it, you're actually going to be at a sub-zero implicit interest rate, again, because of that investment that the lender is making. Your sum of payments in many cases could actually be less than the acquisition cost of the equipment.
That's what I'm looking at here to make this make sense.
Yep.
Again, as a core person that may not understand all the finances stuff.
Yep.
I mean, the cost of the service contracts is going up like crazy every year, 10, 15%. So you're saying not only can I get the instrument, I could work into the loan that I'm going to get the 5, 10 years of service contract bundled in.
Yep.
Now the extra money that I got to pay for the interest rates still ends up cheaper than I would pay buying the service contract every year.
Spot on.
Right. Yeah.
So now this is overall cheaper that I can offer my users, and I can offer them a consistent rate over the next 10 years instead of having to continually refresh this every 1 or 2, and I got to get the new service contract at the new price.
That's a great use case, Dan. I would say locking in multi-year pricing, like locking in pricing for multiple years on your service contracts is a great application. And that's a great exercise to go through in cost avoidance. And I would say a critical component to, because certainly a piece to this is always going to be, if this is something that your core is interested in doing, there is going to need to be a business case made to leadership. And those are the types of cost avoidance benefits you would really want to pull into a conversation like that with leadership. Great example.
Yep.
So then I get that's the simple side. I'm a small core. I just need to get my instrument replaced. That
Yep.
easily makes sense there. So now let's talk about, the bad, what does the repo man look like in the cytometry world? Who's coming to break down my door to grab the cytometer if I don't pay for it? What does it look like if we can't meet that financial obligation?
Yeah. It's a great question. I would say that's much less of a concern in our space because, just being very candid, that should always be an early conversation. Anytime that you are engaging in a conversation about leasing on your campus. And that's one of the challenges I see consistently. And Andrew and I have a lot of these discussions. But when you have like an OEM supplier finance arm coming in to present these deals, oftentimes they can be presented in a way where it makes the researcher feel like, oh, we can just use this equipment and then get rid of it if we don't get the grant. It doesn't work that way. So I think it's important for all users of that are thinking about a program like this. A lease is a commitment from the university and from the core and from the departments that are going to be using it. And frankly, there's not a scenario that you would see where if a core were to come and say, hey, we're not able to support this anymore. The lease agreement itself is not written directly with departments and cores. Those are always going to be written directly with the university itself. So ultimately, the university is the effective borrower, if you want to think of it that way, which is why that buy-in has to be there. That it'll certainly be a bigger conversation, but that's why you need to make sure that you've got funding support there. And many of our biggest users of programs like this, for example, where we have users that say, hey, we want to get an instrument placed. We're going to use a lease to get it here. We're going to defer our first payment for the first year. We want to make no payments on this instrument for the first year because we're applying for S10 funding. And we feel good about our chances in getting it in year 1. Great, but what happens if that funding doesn't come through? And that's a big piece of where we spend our time. Is the easiest solution is if the S10 comes in, the ultimate amount that you're going to be applying for from the NSF or NIH is going to be the payoff amount for the remaining lease payments. The other side to that is, what if we don't get the funding? And I think that's maybe an area that doesn't get enough time spent on it early on when folks just jump into these agreements because they think they're getting a short-term usage agreement, and really it's a longer-term lease. So I think that's just a conversation you've got to be able to have, candidly up front, that this is not hey, we're not getting as much usage on the equipment as we thought we would, and now we want to return this, 6 months in and get a new instrument. This is not the solution for those types of agreements. And if you have a supplier of equipment that's telling you that they can do 1 year or 2 year trials, that's great if they're really willing to do that. But the second they put a lease agreement in front of you, there should be bells going off that we need to do further review and due diligence on this. Because there's a big difference between a handshake agreement of we're going to let you place this in a lab for 6 months to make the case, and hey, we just need you to sign this in order to do this. So hopefully that helps provide a little extra insight there.
It does, but it's a good point. Other question I had is, I'm used to car payments being monthly,
Yep.
right? But a core, like I can go plus or minus 50%, like in what my revenue is on a monthly basis, especially for a small core. So is that built into the model, or do I need to be saving a surplus for those high and low times, or can it be one, payment at the end of the year?
Yes, so we have different solutions. So what we could really do is monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, annual. We also have different step structures. So we really work with the university very early on, when you guys are mentioning what instruments or what equipment you want to help build the best solution for you, central procurement, central finance. So really completely structured in the way we do it.
Now I want to throw in a worst case, because this
Yep.
is definitely stuff that happens. This is relying on the instrument working. Okay, so what if I get the instrument, I get the service contract, but it breaks and I can't get it repaired for 6 months?
Yep.
How is a situation like that handled?
Great question. And I would say that you would put that in your risk category for entering into a lease. So those are going to be issues that are directly related to the service contract you've acquired through the supplier. But it's a great question, because it's important to note that under a true lease agreement, your lease payments don't stop because the equipment is down. And that's something that where, a lender like First American can step in and try to help you leverage, with your equipment supplier. How are you going to make this right for us? But it's a great point. Your lease payments don't stop if the equipment is down. So that's where you do want to be thoughtful about how do you want to structure those payments for your individual core. To your point, Dan, it might look something like we want one lease payment a year, and it's going to hit every June at the end of our fiscal year. And we want that payment to hit June 1st after we've accrued user fees for the year. But yeah, I would say that's something that we've got to put some thought into, right? What happens if the instrument is down for 6 months and we're not generating any fees and still have to make that lease payment at the end of the year?
I mean, do you guys have then that any better, I guess, negotiating power like in the service contracts then to say that, I feel like loosely in the service contracts it says 72-hour response time, but that there's, like, if you can't get the instrument up and working again within a week, that we can build that into the service contract, that like there is a cost to that you guys have to pay for instrument downtime or something else. Is that something that's done, or is that something that you guys can help with, or?
Yeah, it's something I would say we've not been along for the ride on those conversations or had those instances come up, but certainly we could cite multiple instances of riding shotgun with a lab director to help with negotiations with the supplier. For example, we had a gene sequencing lab at a Big Ten facility that they were looking to upgrade a piece of equipment, and we had 6 months remaining still on the lease of the old equipment, and we were able to help leverage the buyout on that lease to negotiate a very aggressive trade-in value for the replacement instrument. Not only that, but we were also able to help the university negotiate 3 months at no cost of the old instrument staying on campus while they cut all the data over to the new machine. So, this, I think that's actually a great use case that we probably haven't been brought into yet or thought about, but how can we structure those service contracts in a way where, hey, we're leasing this equipment, so how is that going to look if we're down more than 72 hours? I think that's a great use case.
So I'm hearing too then that you're not in it here for the one-off, and you're not just in here to sell me a cytometer. You're building these relationships with the university, so when these extremes happen, your business model is on the university buying multiple instruments through this type of a program. You're going to do what you can to kind of help us. But that's a big concern that I have with everything going on in the world right now. If, the lasers aren't made in the US. And so now if what do I do if we can't get a new laser in to fix this, with
Yeah.
6 months? How is that going to affect the structure of these loans? Because the flip side is this is an amazing opportunity to bring in instruments in troubling times and to
Yeah.
reduce a little bit of that burden and uncertainty for the PIs, but there's a lot more risk on the
Yep.
other side of things.
And I would say that that's something that, maybe we haven't had enough conversation with our clients about, and probably will integrate moving forward from this conversation, is how are you structuring those service contracts in a way that, what's going to happen? How are they going to make you financially whole if this equipment is down for longer than that, than the window that's set in your service contract? So I think that's a great takeaway for us.
So that was the small core aspect. Did you have any other thoughts there, David?
No, I kind of wanted to recap all we've been talking about by trying to get an idea of like the spectrum of like going from very poor preparation all the way to like a really great environment where that particular solution would thrive and be very useful. Can you draw me the rough features of the groups that will work, that will basically benefit the best from these? So essentially thinking about people looking at this solution, what do they want to? They want to get use of that service. What should they be thinking about? What do they need to bring to the table to make sure that they get the best out of this, the lease they're going to be getting?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably three categories that we would hone in on would be: number one, you have a facility where there's going to be an instrument acquisition that we already know the user base is there. We're confident that the user base is going to be there. We're applying for S10, but the S10 is a nice to have, not a need to have. How can you help us there? And I think that's a great use case for evaluating a solution like this. I think when you have cores like high-end microscopy cores, gene sequencing cores, again, anywhere where there's technology cycles are compressing and it's getting tougher and tougher to keep up. And maybe costs are coming down a bit, but also useful life is coming down to align with that. So I think any cores where you've got equipment that realistically could stand to be upgraded to the newest model every 3 to 5 years, great application for a lease-based acquisition scheme. And then I would say probably the third application that I would highlight is for maybe more robust core facilities groups, and a couple that would come to mind would be Northwesterns of the world or Rice University, where they've got very robust core facilities administration, where there are Harvard would be another one that would come to mind, where they have pretty robust internal programs that are available for equipment grants and equipment funding. Those are finite resources, and if you engage with the folks that oversee the applications for those internal resources, every single year there is more demand for those programs than what can be allocated out. So we've also had a lot of conversations where basically adding a lease program as another tool in the tool belt for your researchers that say, okay, here's our pot of funding that we have to allocate for instrumentation refresh, from the university this year. We have $2 million to allocate. We had $10 million worth of applications. For those of you that did not get the internal funding, here's another resource that would be available to you if you can find a way to service the lease payment through your user fees and department. So those are probably the three key areas I would say we're having the most conversations and engagement about right now.
Sounds good. Can we talk a bit about the competition would be to go to the manufacturer of the instrument itself? You talked about it a bit already. Basically, some manufacturers will basically turn to a different bank to offer the lease options. In some case, the manufacturer is big enough so that they'll lease against themselves or make a loan against themselves. How do you see these options in this particular context?
Yeah, I can start like from our standpoint. So First American or traditional lessors are vendor agnostic, right? So what we pride ourselves, at least at First American, on is being an extension of your university team. So whatever direction you want to go with, whatever vendor you want to go with, we're helping aid in that process. So we have relationships with a lot of different vendors where we can help step in and help out with any process in between. Another portion of it is some vendor lease agreements. So kind of like what Nick touched on earlier, when there's usually an OEM or a different vendor, they're usually backed by a traditional bank. That's definitely part where we come in, and some leases, if you're on like a true lease agreement, certain vendors have certain restrictions on returning the equipment and then sticking with that equipment vendor. So that's part of First American. That's something that we pride ourselves on, is we work with you to help a different process. So if you want to go with company X for this instrument, the end of 3 years, you want to upgrade to go with company Y, that's something that we help facilitate. Nick, I'm not sure if anything else you want to add into that.
I think it's just incentive, is probably the most concise way I would answer that question. And I think Dan already alluded to this, and that, for an organization like First American, our overarching goal is to develop a relationship at the university level and at the VPR office level and core facilities administration level, so that we can design a program that's going to work across the organization. If you look at the goal of an OEM finance arm, their goal is to place that acquisition. And there's not typically a whole lot of focus on long-term and what that's going to look like down the road. It's how do we get this instrument in the facility now? And it's typically after a long engagement where now we've hit a budget objection, and now we're going to bring in our finance arm to try to overcome the budget objection.
Mhm.
So I just think those are two very different mentalities, I would say, as you're coming and looking at these. I think that there are far fewer OEM organizations that will actually finance these acquisitions themselves versus using a bank. And I think it's important for people to note that sometimes they can even be using a bank, but it still has that company's name on it. That's what's referred to as a private label agreement, where it looks and feels like the company that you're working with, but it's ultimately a completely separate organization. And that's a very deliberate way that they do that. So I would just say, it's not all bad all the time. It's just, I do think there are more important considerations that you have to think about when the primary objective is to place one instrument versus what is the long-term impact going to be. And I'll cite examples of very recent ones we've engaged on where we had an OEM provider that we had the master lease documents for, right? Which is the overarching agreement for anything that you lease with us. This is how it's going to look. And there were little things like, hey, if you want to return this equipment at the end, you've got to let us know in between 90 days and 180 days from the end of the lease. You can't let us know before 180 days. And if you let us know after 90 days, you're automatically going to be in renewal for rents, right? So even if you let us know at day 85 that you want to return the equipment, you're already going to be obligated to additional rents that are not budgeted for, not approved for, and you're going to have to go find that money. I would say very, very simple things like invoicing. And this is one of those ones that sounds silly. Like, what do you mean invoicing? Most of the universities that we work with for these types of agreements, because of how the purchase orders are being generated, we are often paid through a purchase order from the university. If you do not have a purchase order, for most major institutions, if you don't have a purchase order number on your invoice, you're not going to get paid on time. A larger OEM organization that might not be familiar with that, they don't care because you've signed an agreement that says you're going to pay us on time no matter what, even if we don't invoice you. That's a challenge. And now you have a big annual payment for your instrument that you've leased, and now you're going to have a late fee assessed on that that's not budgeted for and not approved because you didn't make your payment on time. So I would say those are the things that seem small, but in our experience, it's critically important that you do as good a job as you can when you're seeking approval on these type of agreements on the front end, to get it right so that you're not in a spot where you have to go back and ask for more funding later because there was something that maybe didn't come up in the sales portion of the conversation. So I would just say those are frankly the biggest differences that we see. I think the benefit to an OEM supplier, because I don't want to make it seem all bad, is that there is a perceived ease there. Again, because of how those programs are marketed, that, hey, we're already working with XYZ company and we're going to finance it through XYZ company. So I think there's just a perceived ease of doing business there that folks don't necessarily realize that you're still going to have to go through master lease evaluation process, and procurement and contracts is going to have to evaluate that agreement, and the terms and conditions are going to have to be reviewed. So I would say that's probably most common, what we see.
If I can again kind of recap that, I think the big takeaway here for the other cores out there listening is that it's possible to get an instrument if you think that it's not possible out there right now. And
Yep.
that for a lot of this finance talk, I'm assuming that the finance part of my university is going to be the best ones. But now that I know that it's not, I just got to wait to get an S10, or I've got to wait until the university says we've got extra money. Do you want something? I can now actively start making plans. And now I can start going to the finance department and saying, look, I want this instrument. There should be ways out there to get it.
Mhm.
You can go talk to OEMs. You can go talk to American First and figure out the best way to do it. Because I'm imagining a lot of the minutia of the contracts is not going to be something that I'm going to be aware of. But just I see that this whole avenue is being hoped for a lot of cores right now. We're just like, I don't know how I'm going to be able to purchase or stay cutting edge or advanced or purchase aging instruments. This is possible, and it's not going to cost you an arm and a leg. But worst case, we can default on what, 3 loans before, you bring in the big gun. So I got 3 months at least to find a new job, if I start defaulting.
Well put, Dan.
Uh,
Don't default on your leases and loans. That's a big one. I am going to be thoughtful about how I frame this component of it, because I want to be very clear in a way that we're not providing guidance or representing in any way that this is a guarantee to happen. I'm just going to share experience from, that our clients have shared with us. So we're going to use the S10 program as an example. This is not unique to one client. This is across multiple clients we've worked with, that folks that have integrated a lease-based acquisition strategy within their cores that are active within the S10 program, we have received feedback that they've actually had better luck with the scoring that they've received, and it's actually been perceived as more favorable when, and maybe I'll just back this up for a second. The NIH is very, very direct and deliberate, and the wording is there about how leases are perceived and can and cannot be used within the S10 program. They do not want to see lease to own commitments. They do not want to see finance leases, right? Where you're basically saying we're doing an equipment loan. So again, this is specifically as it relates to S10. I want to be abundantly clear on that. They want operating type lease structures, right? What we've seen from a handful of our clients, though, is that their cores, they've gone out, they've acquired the lease in advance of the S10 application, and they've actually received favorable feedback on their scoring, because what they see is commentary centered on, we like the lease-based acquisition because it shows that although you haven't locked into long-term ownership of the equipment and obligated yourself to buy it, it shows an institutional commitment to this acquisition. Because the program reviewers know that if they don't get the S10, the university is still on the hook for that lease payment. So we've seen time and time again commentary come back and say, we actually perceive this as more favorable because there's an institutional commitment there. And your science is great and your data is great. And in the event, you have cores that are using this, you may have a core that says, we're gonna acquire an instrument in December through a lease. We're gonna defer our first payment on that lease as long as we can, to try to get the S10 to basically pay all of the lease off. But in the meantime, we're going to be able to generate data from December to June when that application is due, and actually have real data to present in our S10, rather than presenting an S10 application that says, here's all the great things we're going to do once you give us the money for this instrument. And will that even be relevant anymore, a year or two out from when you ultimately receive that funding, if you're lucky enough to get an award. So, I think that's just an important thought for consideration, is how that's perceived, because we get questions about that all the time. Is this viewed more favorably and unfavorably? And I would say that there is not a golden answer to that, because there's a large number of folks that are involved in doing these reviews. So while there's not a golden rule of thumb that this is going to be an advantage for you every time, I can speak to the experience of our clients that it certainly has not been a detriment. If anything, it's been an advantage to their application.
Now, I had a question. That's an amazing thing I hadn't considered. But you've talked about the loan program, right? And that there's going to again be the universities out there that want the newest and latest and greatest every 3 years.
Mhm.
What happens to those instruments, right? You've now got the old used instrument. Are you guys immediately flipping around and selling that? Do you have a giant warehouse where you're keeping all these cytometers? Where is it located? What's the security like? Um, how does that work?
Yeah, we do. So we do have partners that we work with that specialize in refurbish, wipe, resale of this type of equipment. I will say that oftentimes the original manufacturers are actually in line as one of the folks that wants to buy it back because they do not want their technology floating around where they don't know it may be going. So I think there's multiple resources there that we see. And then I would say that while it's not something we're doing today, I think one of the huge opportunities that's out there in this space is as you think about some of these smaller cores, we see a lot of opportunity on the horizon for, maybe these bigger, more robust labs that are turning equipment out every 3 years. How can we help build an ecosystem where, maybe we have a portfolio of buyers that are operating smaller cores that are saying, hey, we can't afford the latest and greatest, but boy, it would sure be nice to have a 3-year-old or 4-year-old microscope or a 5-year-old cytometer, right? Versus what we're working on today. So I would say the latter of those is more of an on the roadmap for us, but yeah, we don't store all this stuff in a warehouse. We have partners that we work with to place this equipment.
That seems like it's much more economical for, Dave's core always wants the latest and the greatest, but he gets rid of it in 3 years and it's hard for him to individually sell it. But if you already got the buyer lined up, then we don't have to go back to the company and then I got to buy it from the company, but you may be able to offer it cheaper by just relocating it. And the
Got
added
it.
benefit is I know Dave and that he takes good care of his instruments.
Right.
That's interesting.
All right, we're about close to the hour. I know you guys are going to ABRF in
Yep.
Las Vegas
Yeah.
this year. Where else? How else can we get in touch with your group, or do we need to get in? Is that procurement that will get in touch with your group to get the lease and whatnot?
Yeah, definitely feel free to reach out. We're happy to engage in any conversation with any researcher that has any questions. Kind of like what we were saying earlier, is we speak with different departments throughout the university. So if you're looking for a question, about an individual lease or individual loan or what other institutions are doing, that we can share some of our client stories. And then usually from there, we'll have that conversation, go back to, procurement or finance, if we don't have a master lease agreement and kind of talk to those terms, conditions, whether it's applicable in the state. Definitely feel free to reach out to us anytime. But both of our names at faef.com is the best way. And it's also through our website, there's direct contact information for Nick and myself.
Yep. Yeah, spot on. And I would actually say, don't wait for procurement to reach out if this is something that's of interest, because if, many of you have worked with your central procurement groups before, they are typically prioritizing top priorities for end users and departments and schools within the university. So our typical cadence with this might be engaging with a core director or a PI. Is this of interest? Yes, it is. Great. We're going to want to bring together research leadership. Most research enterprises that we engage with have an ingrained business officer within the research administration that's kind of the liaison to finance and procurement. So I would say that's the typical cadence of these discussions is there a use case in your lab? If yes, great, we'll engage with research leadership and see if there's appetite at that level. Mm-hmm. And if the answer to both of those questions are yes, then that's where we can really step in and start helping drive those conversations centrally with procurement and finance to facilitate. So certainly we're always happy to engage in those conversations.
Yeah, the earlier the conversations start, the more help we can provide in the process.
And then I know you guys sent out that article last time that we had talked, but that to buy or lease, that was that Harvard case study on the advances of leasing. I think we'll be able to link that into the video as well for anybody that wants to see some hardcore facts.
We'll link both your website where we get contact information and that paper.
That'd be great. And I would just say Doug is a great guy. So Doug is the director of the Harvard Center for Biomedical Imaging, who authored that case study paper. There's great insights in there. He's been doing it a long time. They've done some impressive work as far as building out their user base. So he's a high-end user that I would say has fully implemented this lease-based acquisition strategy where they're swapping instruments out every few years. So they've actually gotten largely away from dependency on federal funding for their acquisitions and really built an institutional support model. So again, that's a publicly accessible case study that you guys will share, and certainly feel free to reach out to Doug if you want to engage with him on that further.
All right. Thank you so much, guys. This has been great.
Thank you guys so much for hosting us.
Yes,
Our
absolutely.
viewers, Lincoln do the things. This is a pretty good conversation. I feel like it should travel around. Get more information about that stuff.
Well, appreciate you both very much.
Thank you
Thank you
very
for bringing us on.
Thank you much. See you guys.
Bye-bye.
Talk soon.